This is Apollo 11. This is Buzz Aldrin descending the ladder from the lunar lander, which had just 6 hours earlier had landed on the lunar surface. And he's being photographed by Neil Armstrong. A couple of points. Look at his right foot. His right foot is not touching the rung of the ladder.
It's like he's jumping on the ladder.
He's jumping it. Well, he's certainly moving. Even in 1/6 gravity, he would be moving. But the camera has recorded the detail very clearly, which indicates that either the camera shutter speed was high enough to record the image without blurring, which is what you'd get if you were trying to photograph a moving object. And obviously Neil Armstrong is not moving the camera because everything else is properly in focus. The point about his foot being not on the rung is that his body is moving, but it's not blurred. And if you then look at a wider shot of the picture, you'll see that his left foot is stuck out at a ridiculous angle. Now, imagine yourself on the top of your garage. You've just finished cleaning the leaves out of the gutter, and you're coming down a ladder about 10 foot up in the air. Is that really how you would approach the ladder?
Yeah,
With one foot stuck out in the air, so it can't support you if you miss with your right foot. And what is that highlight of light on the heel of his boot? We're told that it's a very glossy boot because it's just come out of its wrapper, because he's wearing overshoes. And some people have pointed out that the photograph of Neil Armstrong's spacesuit on display in the National Air and Space Museum, or wherever it's on display, doesn't show these ribbed soles of the feet. The point is, these are overshoes designed to ensure that they could grip on the dusty surface of the moon. But the highlight of light on his heel would appear to be produced by a point source of light, because this whole side of the lunar lander is in shadow. As you can easily see on the later photographs, there we have on the left-hand side there, we can see that the lunar lander is in shadow, because you can see the shadows cast by the legs of the lander.
The sun is behind the vehicle, you can see quite clearly.
Yeah. So Buzz Aldrin is in shadow at this point. But the point is that the directly illuminated surface of the moon behind him is not overexposed, as you would expect if you were trying to get detail in a shadow, in a person who's standing in shadow area, on this particular film, the Kodak Ektachrome film, which does not have a very high tolerance of exposure latitude.
This has been tested several times. The Mythbuster tested it. They wanted to claim, Mythbusters, that this was really shot on the moon. It wasn't shot in a studio under artificial light. So they actually recreated the image. They recreated the image in a studio under artificial light. It's actually the only person who actually tried to do an honest experiment with this was Jarrah White, an Australian Apollo researcher. He did it in sunlight, and he encountered the very problem that you're talking about, Marcus.
Yeah, that you will get overexposure, because photographic film can record incredible detail, but you have to get the exposure right for it to do so. This is not a digital image, so anybody under the age of about 50 looking at this image thinking it's a digital image, it's not. It's a film image, and they record light very differently. Photographic film records light very differently from digital images. I won't go into the detail of it, but it does, believe me. If it's not overexposed in the background, and the explanation offered by those people who support NASA's contention that they landed a man on the moon, is that this illumination in the shadow area is from the special reflective properties of the lunar surface, which has little glass globules, or little glass balls as a result of meteorite impact, which reflect light. Yes, of course they do, but not sufficient light. Because if you look at the moon, a full moon, you can look at it quite comfortably with eyes. You don't need sunglasses, but you can't look at the sun. The sun is extremely powerful, and the light reflected from the moon originates from the sun. if you measure it, the reflections off the lunar surface are about 8% of the light that hits the lunar surface. That is not sufficient to provide the illumination we see in this photograph.
On the subject of digital image, the NVIDIA graphics card design company actually did a digital reproduction of this.
Yes, they did.
Yeah, in which they actually claim that it is actually possible to actually have this effect using just sunlight. But I know that some people have looked at their data, and it turns out that it's not the evidence they claim it is.
It's interesting you mention Gerard White, because he was the very first person as he said it, he called foul. He's Australian. I call foul on this film, he said. This is the NVIDIA film, which tries to show that, of course, they could recreate this image exactly the way it's shown in the photograph. And he said, yes, they can recreate the reflection off the lunar surface if the reflectivity of the lunar surface is set high enough. He said, what is the reflectivity of the lunar surface that NVIDIA used in their film? And they wouldn't tell him. They wouldn't say what the reflection was. So he actually used Photoshop, which can analyze the RGB settings in any section of a photograph, and found that the reflective properties that they were using was over 40%. Well, of course it would illuminate a shadow area at 40%. Just to go back to this recreation of this photograph by the Mythbusters, they wanted to bust the Mythbusters. And what they found that the Mythbusters had done, in order to get enough illumination into the shadow area of the lander to show up the astronaut, they had to wear white coats. And when challenged by Gerard White about the whole Mythbusters program, Jamie said, well, it's not science, you know, it's entertainment.
Well, that's it. Says it in a nutshell, doesn't it? That's the whole problem.
Marcus, what's that piece of kit, the left-hand image we're looking at, that piece of kit at the bottom?
Right, left-hand image, that's the little transporter trolley thing that they carried all their kit around in.
Oh, okay, like tools and things like that.
Yeah, a sort of golf cart type thing.
Okay.
They sort of towed around with them. But the point about these two pictures, which shows, as I say, Al Bean on Apollo 12, is look at the horizon in relation to the astronaut. It's the same astronaut, Al Bean, photographed by Pete Conrad. On the same roll of film, these two pictures have one other picture between them.
Yeah.
We select these two to show the position of the camera that took the photograph. Where was that camera? We're told it was mounted on his chest, like we see on the left-hand picture.
Yeah.
If that's the case, a photograph taken of another astronaut of approximately the same height would show what we see on the left, i.e. the camera would be pointing more or less straight at the photographer.
Yeah.
And if you see the photographer who took the picture, who is reflected in the visor, he's not holding his camera above his head, which is where you would where the photograph on the right would appear to show, because you're looking down on top of the camera, you're looking down on top of his helmet, you're looking down on top of his backpack. Now if you compare that with the left-hand picture, you don't see the top of his helmet, you don't see the top of his backpack, and you certainly don't see the top of the camera.
The visor is so reflective, you can actually see the photographer, and you can confirm exactly where his actual position when he's taking these photographs.
Exactly, yeah, which is quite helpful, because by looking at it just as a photograph, not as a record of a scientific achievement of man landing on the moon, forget all that. This is just a photograph. Where was the camera?
Could it be, Marcus, that in the visor of the man on the right, it looks like his left hand has got the camera, but it looks like the camera is being slightly raised? Is that correct?
Yes, his hand will not be right by the camera.
Yeah, there. It looks like his left hand.
Yes.
Is his left hand holding the camera slightly higher or not?
He's holding the trigger.
He's holding the trigger. So
Yes.
is the camera locked in place? Does it detach, or is it completely locked in place and that's it?
No, it's locked in place.
Yeah.
As you can see in both of those photographs, you can see the camera is locked onto his chest.
Yeah, and there's no way of detaching it. There's no pin that detaches it at all.
No, there's no pin. But there's if you look below the camera, you see the little black stick. That's the pistol grip.
Okay, yeah.
Right down here.
That, yeah.
So
It's a curious one. It's a curious one. I mean, one of the arguments that Peter Bassett raised was maybe they're on a hill. Maybe the person taking the shot is angling down from a hill. What would you say to that?
Well, where's the hill?
Yeah, I'm looking at the horizon and it doesn't.
I mean, suddenly you've got this whacking great hill, because it's going to be quite a big hill, because he's quite close to the subject. The photographer is relatively close to the subject, maybe about 10, 12, 15 feet away from him. Because don't forget, he's using a wide-angle lens.
Most likely neither one of these two cameras took the photograph, because it would mean they would have to change magazines on both of them to have the two images on the same magazine.
Yeah.
And also these
Which means they'd have to detach both their cameras, change up the magazine so one guy could take the other person's photograph and keep it on the same magazine.
And just make sure you don't get any dust in it while you do it, because because obviously you can't take your gloves off to do it, because you've got to wear your full spacesuit, and they're a bit dusty because they've been picking up rocks and
More than dust, that's wet.
It is, yes.
Also, these two pictures, I believe, were taken quite close to each other, which means they were in the same location. So if he's on a hill in the right-hand picture, you can see quite clearly that on the left-hand picture there is no hill.
Yeah, we see that's the explanation that is offered by people who support NASA, because they've got to come up with some halfway logical explanation. And if you say, well, the photographer was standing on a hill, to many people that makes a bit of sense. But the point is that if you're going to say that, you've got to prove there was a hill there, or a crater, or some other explanation. Because the astronauts, assuming they were on the moon, which they weren't, but let's assume for the moment they were, these guys are in considerable danger. If they'd tripped or fallen over, or punctured their spacesuit in any way, they're dead, toast, end of story. Body on the moon, getting back to Earth. So they're going to take a degree of care, and this is not what you see when they're bouncing around in the videos, which are taken at the same time. They're sort of jolly, they're even singing little songs as if it's...
And they're playing golf.
And they're playing golf. I mean, how stupid is that? What a ridiculous thing to even think of.
I've never come across the wet knee. This is very interesting. Okay, so playing devil's advocate, could it be a leak in the cooling system? Could he have wet himself, peed himself in some way?
Not that far down.
Well, I mean, it could have dribbled. Like, for instance, presumably there's some way of catching...
You're astronaut.
Presumably there's some way of catching pee. If they're out for 2 hours... 2 hours 20 minutes, presumably they will need to pee at some point. Presumably there's some kind of tubing system that deals with that. Could that have leaked at all or anything like that?
It's giant nappies they're using.
Oh, right, okay.
But Scott has got a very, very good picture showing a wet flag.
Yeah.
The wet flag. Let's have a look at the wet flag.
Can you show us that, Scott?
And
The wet flag?
yes,
From
that's on
Apollo
Apollo
17, I think. Is it?
yeah, Apollo 17.
The Apollo 17 wet flag, I have it in...
I'm getting the distinct feeling we're not going to be too popular amongst NASA.
Oh, look, here we go, wet flag.
So, yeah, do you want to explain that photo, Scott? Just for people to know about it.
Oh, we've lost it. Oh, okay.
I can zoom it right in there.
Oh.
Yeah, so this is from Apollo 17, and I think it's...
You can see it's all drying back.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter how you look at that, you can see it's drying back on that edge back in.
Okay, playing devil's advocate, what if it somehow had water damage within the lunar lander and they just... Say again?
You are in a vacuum. There are no liquids in a vacuum.
Okay,
So
but it means inside the lunar capsule in the module.
Yeah, inside the capsule. So it's wet inside the capsule, they bring it out onto the lunar surface, what would happen?
There would be no moisture left in it within seconds.
It would just disappear. It would just
At
disappear.
that much of a vacuum, it would just be gone.
Wow.
Is it correct to say that if you took water out into a vacuum in a cup, it just boils away or something? Is that right?
Wouldn't boil away. Not in that vacuum. It'd just be gone.
What,
You are in
evaporates?
an infinite vacuum.
Okay, it floats off somewhere.
Even if you drop the pressure in just a bell jar like they do in a science class, and you drop it down to 4.5 pounds of pressure instead of 14.5 pounds, it's boiling at room temperature.
Right.
By the time you get down, you only have 1 pound of pressure left. It's just gone.
I can't explain that because I mean you can't say that's shadow because
We're in a different vacuum here. We're in a whole different kind of power vacuum here.
Yeah.
Also, the claim was, and I can see it on your text there, that it was always an aluminium-made flag, which I found a bit of a strange one.
That was a video that a famous PhD said it was made out of aluminum.
Right.
Or
So
tin.
it's not really.
And I won't mention his name.
It sounds like he's got the preconceived hypothesis disorder.
Scott, you brought up.
PAT, people having dreams.
I don't know if you guys talked about this in the first half when I wasn't here, but you mentioned the missing handle. Can we have a look at that picture back again, where the astronaut's coming down the ladder and there's no handle outdoor on the door? Yeah.
Oh, on the door?
On the door.
The lunar module, I believe, where Buzz Aldrin's coming back down.
Yeah.
It certainly looks like it's gaffer tape or something on the inside of that.
Oh, they just tape all over the place. Buzz mentions the fact that, there's no handle on the outside.
Yeah.
So presumably it's up to the person on the inside to open that. Is that what we're saying?
Right,
Yeah.
when they initially got in it, they came down through the upper hatch.
Right.
Right? And I don't know how they practiced with this thing in different things if there was no handle there. They must have known it. I think it was very quickly put together piece of equipment that they didn't have any knowledge of.
It just looks like a Blue Peter job.
I think Blue Peter did a better job of it.
Yeah, it's very early days of Doctor Who sort of set building, isn't it, really?
That's a nice one, yeah. No, in fact, that point you made about, well, couldn't the guy inside open it? There was nobody inside to open it, because they were both on the surface. If there had been any leak at all of any air inside the craft when they were outside on the surface, they wouldn't have been able to open the door at all, because the pressure of the air would have been far too great. So they were running an incredible risk of having the door partially closed. Why bother? They were going to get back in anyway. The craft was depressurized. They didn't need to do that.
There's some numbers on the vacuum of space. Okay, and the best we can test here on Earth with the newest machine is a Torr value of 10 to the minus 6. Okay, and they've never put any humans in that to test it. They don't put humans in there to test that.
It's far too dangerous.
The most they've tested the suits and the original CSM, not the LEM, just the CSM, was down to a 10 to the minus 3, just a low rough vacuum down. You have to realize all the testing, you're only getting between 80 and 100 miles off the surface of the Earth with that kind of a vacuum. Anything above that, as soon as you leave the Earth's atmosphere, the vacuum goes up dramatically.
As you said, the difference between the vacuum and the atmosphere within the craft would be significant enough to mean you need major design differences.
Maybe I can pull up.
You have a chart which says interstellar space, 10 to the minus 17 pascals.
There's a
All
picture of the Glenn Research Center vacuum chamber. It'll pull a torr value of 10 to the -6. The walls are reinforced concrete. They're 8 feet thick. Another 2 feet of steel. The concrete has to be lined when they're pulling a vacuum down so it doesn't pull the air right through the concrete. Now, if you believe the space suits are as strong as that building, then you can go to the moon.
Well, I'd like to put Professor
This
Brian
is,
Cox
by
into
the way,
one of
this
them and
building,
send him
building is about, give you at about 125 miles off the surface of the Earth.
Scott, I'm
Yes.
noticing there's a few little images of some of the artifacts on the surface, footprints and odd rocks and things. Do you want to go into those a little bit?
Yes, I can. What I was going to do is pull up my presentation and
The presentation really sort of says it all. Take us through that if you like, because that really kind of goes from A to B of the whole thing you've been finding, really, because that sort of says it all.
Okay, you can see that just fine.
Yeah.
This is the Apollo 17 rovers, and there are 3 distinctive rovers being demonstrated in the photographs, and of course they ever only took one along. Okay? The one here on the left is the Apollo 15 rover, and it's being used in 15, 16, and 17. And as we go through, I will show you how to identify this particular machine. This is a brand new machine, doesn't have anything on the back. Fenders are perfect, everything else on it. This one, the fenders are missing on the back. And if you look at the frame rail under here, the length of the frame rail, and you see it sticks way out past with much shorter arms on it. Where that piece comes up is much shorter. This one's still underneath.
So we're being told this is the same vehicle. Is that what you're saying?
Well, they only had one.
They only had
Apollo
one.
17 had one rover.
But so this is all from the same mission?
This is
17?
all pictures from Apollo 17. Okay? This one on the left is Apollo 16, and you can see the rear fender is missing on it, and this is how they repaired it in Apollo 17. It's the same rover. But it's the same rover being used in 15, 16, and 17, this particular one. In Apollo 16, this rover was damaged when the entire machine was dropped in Apollo 15. The entire LEM when they were doing the simulated landing, and the rover literally smashed, like it came right off the machine itself and was damaged. When they were trying to fix it up continuously, here's the steering arm is gone right on the ground. It's laying down here on the ground.
So you're saying they were using the same rover for each mission, or trying to? Was that
all
correct?
of the equipment? It's the same LEM. It's the same experimental equipment. It's the same rovers for all 6 missions.
And so were they? Because I don't know that much about the different missions. Like, were they landing at the same?
Shot on the same location.
If only these guys would put all that obsessive
landing.
interest into doing the same thing with the Apollo missions. Because you see these same continuity errors. What you just said, Andrew, is actually absolutely correct. You just said, well, did they shoot these 3 missions together when they were pre-shooting the fictionalized version? And the answer is yes. Actually, if it was real, you wouldn't get that.
On the right-hand side here, they are traveling from one station to another. And they're actually driving over top of tracks. That's what it shows in the video. They're driving over tracks to a new location that they've never been to before. The actual steering is broken, and the only way to drive this machine is backwards because they would splay out with this broken. So they actually reversed the video when they shot it. And you can see by the chevron pattern on the tire matches the direction they're going. If they were driving back over their own tracks, the chevron pattern would be in a different direction. And they actually shot photographs of almost 70 pictures of that or more, shooting this at the same time through. And you can match them up. This is Apollo 15. This is the rover with no tracks. Okay? It is here again in 16, and it is here again in 17.
Okay, Scott, just hold you there. We did bring this up with Marcus and Peter Bassett. Peter Bassett said, well, the reason there's no tracks is because they had to assemble the Lunar Rover. So they brought all the parts together, which is why you see the footprints, and there's no tracks because they had to assemble it all together.
And carry it out of
That's
away into the lunar
inconsistent
module.
with the video of it being downloaded then. Because this is almost 100 feet away from the rover, or from the LEM at this point. Do you think they carried it around and carried all the pieces out to it?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's one of the things I raised with Peter. Why was it assembled so far away? I don't think he had an answer for it. Could be wrong.
The data and the log files show that it was driven around the LEM to the other mesa where the equipment was, and everything was loaded on from that mesa.
Right.
Okay, what you're looking at here, each one of these, the rear left wheel has an oil leak. And again, no liquids in space. Okay? Doesn't matter what the liquid is, there are no liquids in space. And the oil is making the dirt stick to the rim. You can see the front rim doesn't have it, but the rear does.
I mean, if there's no liquids in space, presumably the lubrication oil on the axle would not have been in a sealed chamber, as either any more than so. You would have the lubrication oil itself wouldn't actually work. It would also not work in a vacuum.
Well, apparently they removed the oil lubrication from the camera, so the cameras wouldn't work either. Right. This is Apollo 16, and this is the jump photo shoot on it, and they pulled this absolutely brand new rover out. I've never seen another photograph of it anywhere. I have all the photographs, and it has a double rib on the front left fender.
Yeah.
Okay, and it's the only shot of this rover on it.
So they actually have a model there that doesn't actually appear in the rest of the
Any other photo.
footage.
This is Apollo 17, and this is just in front. That's the right rear fender on each. This one doesn't show the fender, but it's right in front of the fender on both. And this is the frame of each of the three separate rovers that are being used in Apollo 17. And you can see quite different with a huge difference in the way these things were actually constructed. Right? No possible way you could have, just from different lighting or anything else, they couldn't change all of this on there.
Scott, have you put this to NASA, and if so, what's their answer?
There's no response from NASA.
There's a surprise.
Okay. However, down here, you can see that there's three completely different sets of tire tracks.
Yeah. 3
separate rovers shown, and 3 separate tires shown.
My goodness, yeah, you have very different. You have like they always say, you mustn't mix the tracks on if you're doing if you're on the roads, but obviously they've done it on the moon. Interesting. I want to make a point about NASA and what Andrew said. NASA apparently have really not made a serious effort to actually respond to these allegations. They did get a guy to actually talk about. His name was Dr. Walsh, and he talked about for a while after the Fox documentary came out, and he was on David Percy and Mary Bennett's video too. There was a guy called James Oberg, he's well known as a UFO debunker. He actually was commissioned by NASA to write a book about this, to refute everything that Scott and Marcus have been talking about. But apparently that project was cancelled. Oberg then said he was going to carry on writing the book and find another publisher, but the book has not yet appeared.
Well, he's obviously having trouble finding a publisher 15 years down the line.
He didn't even bring it out on like Lulu or anything. I mean, it's like he's just given up on it. Or maybe someone told him to give up on it.
Yes, because it was going to attract more attention to NASA than they wanted to deal with. Because after the Fox TV program came out in 2001, that generated a vast amount of criticism of NASA. And then Fox went ahead and repeated it, so it generated even more criticism. So NASA wanted to deflect from this. Hence, James Oberg was said, get lost, guys, we're not interested in a book about it as well. Had enough trouble with the film.
Scott, just stop there with your scrolling. Up a little bit. And those little rock things, down a bit, down a bit, down a bit, down a bit. Stop. Those rock things, Screen Hunter 21. Yeah, just explain what's going on with those.
Okay, and this one that's the arm of the rover is finally broken off. The steering linkage broke off to it, and they dropped this golf ball down beside of it. You can definitely see the backdrop here is just one beautiful line on this particular photograph, and this is because the ground is very wet, and of course the footprints are darker underneath because the ground's even wetter underneath there. And you can see it around here how wet it is on the ground on here, and we're going to get into some more water.
It's almost as if maybe this was an outdoor set and it rained slightly.
Oh, absolutely. In this particular, this is the cuff checklist, and you can see it's just a storyboard on how they put the each scene together. So up in here, the LMP shows exactly where he's going to be standing, where he's already walked. Like this is done months before they went to the moon. Where the disturbed area is, where the rock was moved, where the hole was, and where they put the rock. And then the commander, the 4 different positions he's going to be standing in, the number of photographs he's going to take, and the camera settings for each photograph. Over here, this is how to shoot the scene to film this rock, and it even describes the mineral contents inside the rock once it's split open. How could they possibly know that months before the launch? How could they identify? If you look at the LRO pictures, the imaginary LOR pictures, I mean the lander's 32 feet across and it takes up 2 pixels. Right? How could they find out where this rock was? It's only 18 inches across. This is the Apollo 16. This is the Grand Prix, and which you see the Grand Prix video. If you Google that, you can see them do the video, and they're just talking about, oh well, turn it to the right, turn it to the left, or give it a hard left, or whatever. And he's going, oh, I don't know if I can do that. Here, it's all laid out for them. The 4 craters, how they drive through them, the 2 camera positions where they're going to be sitting, and there's supposed to be one astronaut operating these 2 cameras, plus taking photographs at the same time.
Can I bring up some obvious objections that might be on people's lips right now? And one of those is that it wasn't just NASA who were monitoring this particular mission. Apparently, several radio telescopes were actually tracking the craft on the way to the moon. So, for example, Jodrell Bank telescope claims to have followed the command module all the way to the moon.
Well, when I'm driving in my car listening to the radio, okay, there's no possible way I can locate where that signal's coming from.
Yeah. Oh, and Ben, one point on that Jodrell Bank tracking. Jodrell Bank were actually using their big 300-foot diameter dish, the one we see in all the pictures. They were using that dish to track the Russian craft, which was also on its way to the moon at the same time as Apollo 11. NASA had an office at Jodrell Bank, and they were using their 50-foot diameter dish to track Apollo. And they then claimed to have been able to identify the path that the Apollo 11 lander took as it approached the lunar surface. And they're very proud of their little graph which they've drawn to show when Neil Armstrong took over manual control of the craft and how they landed it on the moon, which is absolute nonsense, because no radar can operate at 240,000 miles to pick up an object 20 foot across and identify its trajectory at that distance. It's fiction, creating this image of landing on the moon. Well, of course, Jodrell Bank tracked it, and Jodrell Bank are a reputable place, therefore it must be true. No, it's not. NASA were telling them what to do. Jodrell Bank were far more concerned with tracking the Russian craft, which is what they were employed to do by the Russians with the full knowledge of the British and American governments, There was no problem about that. And then we get on this ridiculous story of the ham radio operators who were listening in to the Apollo command module.
That's another one I heard.
How are they listening when the command module and the lunar module, well, the command module specifically, were transmitting back to Earth, we're told, using the gigahertz frequency? Again, another fantasy, trotted out by people trying to support this ridiculous deception.
I'm glad you brought up the Russians, because this is another issue. And indeed, His Royal Cocksness actually mentioned this in the same documentary. Yeah, he's so clever, don't question him. But of course, this was the Cold War. This was the heart of the Cold War. The USA, Soviet Union locked in this bitter space race. Now, of course, NASA were controlling all the information, as you explained, but there was one other country in those days that had the capability of actually checking what NASA had done on the moon and reporting back immediately if there was any fraud. I mean, today there's 6 or 7 countries, but in those days there was one other. And that, of course, was the Soviet Union. So wouldn't they be the first people to say, oh, look, come on, they're cheating. They're cheating. This isn't fair. Especially when you consider that the KGB had penetrated the Western establishment to such a great degree. We still don't know completely exactly how successful they've been. Some of the spies are probably still alive and hoping they don't get caught. So why on earth didn't the Russians say anything? Because they must have known. They must have done. They must at least suspected, and they'd be able to check it out.
But who in Russia would have blown the whistle? Look, there was nobody in Russia who knew the Americans were cheating, any more than there was anybody in the West knew the Americans were cheating. In the late 1960s, at the same time Apollo was allegedly on its way to the moon, in the late 1960s, the Soviet Union, as it was then, were desperately trying to sign contracts for the sale of their natural gas, one of the very few resources they have in abundance, into West Germany, Austria and Italy. The contract was signed by their foreign minister, Andrei Gromyko, in August 1968 for the supply of natural gas. Now, that is still going on. Russian natural gas is sold into Western Europe, throughout Western Europe, in vast quantities. Nord Stream 2 is the Baltic pipeline, goes under the Baltic Sea, from near St. Petersburg down to the north coast of Germany to supply the natural gas.
Another important point, which was it? I wasn't going to say. So it'll come back to me in a minute.
Well, actually, one point on that about the whole cooperation business. One of the last things that President Kennedy did on November the 12th, 1963, 10 days before he was assassinated, was to sign an executive order ordering NASA to cooperate with the Soviet Union on space travel. Because as he so accurately decided, why are we spending the money and they're spending the money? Why don't we just do it together? That became the Apollo-Soyuz cooperation. So the Soviet Union and America were cooperating right from the beginning.
Both the Russians and the Americans sent probes to both Venus and Mars. Now, all the most successful Martian probes were American. All the most successful Venusian probes were Russian.
Or one could say that because it was very well known within certain circles, fairly high up in the American political and military establishments, that E.T. was out there, do we know if he's friendly or not? Russia said, well, we'll go and have a look at Venus, you're going to have a look at Mars, and we'll report back. That picture you've got there about the lander, I think, brings up a very interesting point.
On the left-hand side here is the Apollo 15 diagram of the descent stage of the LEM. And in quadrant 1 is the helium tank is located right there on the spot. On the right-hand side is Apollo 15. Yeah, this is 15, I think. Could be 15, 16, 17, doesn't matter. It has a rover. And you can see the rover's right there in quadrant 1. And to spot that, it's counterclockwise. The quadrants are counted counterclockwise from the ladder around. So they simply removed the helium tank And what the helium tank does is to pressurize the 4 fuel tanks to push the fuel through the engine. Okay? Here, they don't have the tank. It's simply removed, so there's no way to pressurize the fuel. And the fuel sits in each of the 4 squares, and the engine sits in the center. And if you can't pressurize the fuel to push the through to the engine won't run. So it doesn't matter whether the helium tank is there or not. It didn't really matter because that thing wasn't running. It didn't leave a blast crater. Okay, and there's no possible way that was going to happen. And that's how they added the rover to the machine. Okay, there's extra batteries have to be added for it and everything else. The extra battery packs for their backpack, the Bliss, were also located right down on the side of that helium tank, and they're completely removed as well, just to put the rover in place. Okay, it's just a stage model that they've done. The thing certainly never flew.
Wow.
And one piece on that, if you could just go back to that previous picture, because it shows the top of the lunar lander, basically the launch pad for the upper stage, the Ascent
stage, yeah.
where the astronauts were. Now, when they took off from the lunar surface, allegedly, they fired their rocket, because there were two rocket engines, one in the lower section, as Scott has indicated, in the center of that right-hand diagram, was the descent stage rocket, 10,000 pound thrust. The Ascent stage rocket, using the same fuel, hypergolic fuel, was in the center of the Ascent stage. But when you fire a rocket, it tends to produce quite a lot of exhaust and heat and noise and all the things that rockets do. So where did the exhaust go as the Ascent stage was building up its power to take off? Because there is no exhaust hole. There's nowhere for the exhaust to go.
No, it's going to blow right down on here and right down on top of those fuel tanks.
Yeah, and more than likely ignite them, as well as fry the astronauts.
Because that's
damaged.
when you. I was going to say, when you see the launch of the Saturn V, and this also goes to the shuttle, they fire those F1 engines and the shuttle engines for at least 5 or 6 seconds. And like in the case of the shuttle, there was 2 clamps that held down to the wings of the whole thing to hold it there whilst the pressure built up of those rockets firing. Once everything was at maximum thrust, then they just let it go. It's rather like you're holding a balloon filled with air, and once it's filled with air, then you let go, and then the balloon will fire off. So it has to be held in place for it to build up the pressure. But there was no sort of like Marcus says, field of flame or something coming out from those rockets at all. Like 5 or 6 seconds maybe before the actual launch of the Ascent module. It was like as if it was just on a spring or something.
And also, what you've just described, what's been described, could do considerable damage to the Ascent stage as well, because it's rather when you're like firing a gun. That's a solid object. Now, if you do that, it's quite likely it'll backfire.
Yeah, and it's right close to you. Yeah.
You can imagine a shockwave.
Would you like to see a video of the takeoff? I got one handy.
Sure.
Yeah, let's go for it. Let's go for it.
You can see that when these explosive bolts were triggered to launch this thing, when it's supposed to fly off in space, that the explosion blew these panels off, or partially blew them off, and you can see the side of the spacecraft there just kind of moving. So to me, it looked like that was just kind of rippling in the wind, and what that would mean, and then you go back into the transcript, listen to audio, and kind of the massive of the astronauts mention the anomalies.
Right.
It's interesting. All those explosive debris, bolts, and things like that never destroyed the camera that was filming it.
Nor the actual pressure hull of the spacecraft.
Yeah.
That'd have been a disaster, because it's another case in which you get a leak in the spacecraft, which would release the atmosphere, and the astronauts would suffocate in the vacuum.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
all these things that could have gone wrong. At the same time, we have this. This brings us back to the secret space program. I mean, wouldn't it be easier just to let the secret space program do whatever was necessary in space? And NASA, why would NASA take the risk where the whole world is watching?
Yeah.
Because NASA had a plan B. Plan B was the backup.
Maybe NASA weren't aware of the secret space program. They were just going on their own merry way, and the secret space program was so compartmentalised that no one knew anything about it anyway. Oh, now this is an interesting thing, isn't it, Scott? This is the command module, and you've noticed some interesting reflections on the actual capsule.
Well, yes, you're looking at a couple of doors right there. You can see the window and the doors. Those are colonial-style doors. You can see the door handle there. And then there's 3 guys standing back here in the background.
So
what
we should
actually have to realize is that, well, first of all, the CSM is below the lamp. And if you watch the actual video, it goes right down to a point where you can't even see it. And the moon's lit up behind it. The only thing you should be able to see in that reflection is the blackness of space.